This episode's guest is Samuel Wilkinson, a medical doctor, author, and associate director at the Yale Depression Research Program. Dr. Wilkinson is one of the foremost researchers on ketamine and depression. Welcome, Dr. Wilkinson. Thank you, Dr. Wilkinson, for coming on today.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So there's lots of things I kind of want to cover. So first, you are the assistant director of the Depression Research Program here at Yale?
The medical director.
The medical director.
Yep.
Okay. So tell me what that entails.
So we have a program that mostly focuses on treatment development in depression. And there's a variety of different ways we try to learn new things, but most common is through clinical trials. So there's a treatment or type of therapy, then we would help run the clinical trials, either designing them ourselves or partnering with organizations from industry to test new therapies.
And if I'm not wrong, with a lot of them have to do with ketamine, or at least some of them.
Yeah, definitely.
So can you tell us what you know about, like, obviously you've done a ton of research on ketamine.
Yeah.
There's probably so many different things you could go into, but what is ketamine looking like now, and what does it look like for the future?
Yeah, well, so ketamine, the story of ketamine starts in the 1950s, when a drug company was trying to develop a new anesthesia medicine, and they developed not ketamine, but the first drug they developed was phencyclidine, which is known as PCP or angel dust. So this, it's used. It's used recreationally. Doesn't have any medical purposes, at least as far as I'm aware. But they found quickly that was way too potent at a certain part of the brain, and so they went back to the lab. They tweaked things, and they made the next version, the next generation of experimental therapeutic to be less potent at what's called one of the glutamate receptors. And that's where ketamine came. And really quickly, it became fairly widespread. And I think one of the reasons it did is because what was going on around then, this is the 1960s now, was the Vietnam War. And ketamine, unlike most anesthetics, does not reduce blood pressure and heart rate. And so, therefore, it's relatively safe to give outside of a hospital setting, right? Most anesthetics, doctors only feel safe administering it in a hospital setting where patients are very closely monitored. But in a war setting, if you have someone who has a bullet and needs to be removed, you need to do procedures right there in the field. Ketamine is relatively safe to do in the field without fancy medical equipment. So it became pretty popular because of that, and because of the kind of the interesting intersection of history and what was going on, historically. Then it wasn't until it was 2000 really and the studies were done here at Yale. The first really, really well cited study showing that ketamine at low doses could be a powerful antidepressant. That was done here at Yale. It was a very small number of patients. But since that time, that was published in 2000. Since that time, and especially in the around 2010, that's when it really took off in terms of research interest and so forth. 2019 was when a form of ketamine, or S-ketamine, was approved by the FDA as a therapy for treatment-resistant depression.
And is that one taken like nasally, the S-ketamine?
Yes. S-ketamine, the FDA-approved product, is a nasal spray.
And so what's really the difference between the two ways of administering the
Well, there's more than two ways, but the most commonly used one in research settings is the nasal spray, as in the case of S-ketamine, or intravenous, which is what we call racemic ketamine. So from organic chemistry, some molecules have like mirror images of each other. They call them, sometimes refer to them as like the right hand image and the left hand version. And S-ketamine is just one of those forms. So when you just say ketamine, generally, it usually refers to both the right and the left forms of ketamine. But S-ketamine is just the purified left kind of quote-handed form of ketamine.
Interesting.
Right? So the thinking is that the way that ketamine was working had to do with a certain receptor in the brain, and the S-ketamine was much more potent at binding that receptor compared to the R form of ketamine. And so that's why they chose, it's one of the reasons that they chose to focus on S-ketamine when the company that developed S-ketamine did so, started those initial studies.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
So something that I'm kind of wondering about too is obviously, psychedelic medicine is kind of a huge topic right now.
Yeah.
So ketamine, it's the only legalized psychedelic medicine be administered medically, right?
Well, I would say it's the only therapy in that kind of space. And some people will say it's not a psychedelic. You could argue about this for a long time,
right?
Who you're talking about, but it's the only one that has an FDA kind of stamp of approval for mental illness. Most of the other quote unquote psychedelics are what we call Schedule 1 drugs, and the schedule that's something done by the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Agency, and so there's schedules 1 through 5, and they do this for drugs that have abuse potential. And Schedule 1 is like the most. Schedule 1 basically means there's no accepted medical use and there's high abuse liability. Okay, so psilocybin, LSD, all those things, those are all Schedule 1. Now, if the FDA were to approve forms of them, then kind of by default they would be rescheduled because they now would have an accepted medical use as judged by the FDA. But they would still be quote controlled substances. So schedules 1 through 5 apply to what are called controlled substances.
So what's that debate about ketamine possibly not being a psychedelic?
I mean, this term psychedelic gets thrown around a lot. I frankly don't know what it means. I think what it mostly means is that, the drug, when administered in a certain dose, causes an alteration in perception that, could be described as trippy or, out of body or something like that. But if you take a broad view of the definition of psychedelic, then it would, you could potentially argue that anything that produces an altered state of kind of consciousness while people are still awake could be a psychedelic. In that case, ketamine would be, but then a whole lot of other things would be as well.
Right.
So I guess I would call ketamine kind of psychedelic adjacent, but most people in the field would not consider it a classic psychedelic.
Right.
Yeah.
So that being said, what is it used to treat right now in the field?
Ketamine?
Yes.
Well, so this is where a lot of people don't, including doctors, don't understand. The approved use for S-ketamine is treatment-resistant depression and depression with suicidal ideation. Now, ketamine, when we just say ketamine, like the IV form or other forms, has no approval for any psychiatric illness. But it can be used that way because this is called off-label prescribing. So, and it's very, very common. So if you have, like, for instance, in PTSD, there are only so far 2 drugs that are approved for PTSD, and one is one is sertraline and the other is paroxetine. Okay. So those are both what are called SSRIs.
Right.
And so if you use another SSRI for PTSD, you're technically using it for a purpose for which it's not approved. That's called off-label. And that's allowed. Okay. That's allowed, but usually it's very adjacent, right? Because fluoxetine is very similar to sertraline, and so no one would really kind of say, oh, that's a really dangerous practice or something like that. But when we first started using ketamine outside of research practices, this was it was a big jump because it was an anesthesia medicine, being used by psychiatrists, or in addition to other types of specialist, but that was a bigger jump. Now, as ketamine is approved, it's less of a jump, but I think it's very important that people using ketamine in terms of a medical context, they stay very close to the kind of approved dosages of esketamine. All right. There's a lot of things about ketamine that even, many doctors who provide it don't even know. Like ketamine is neurotoxic, right? It kills it damages brain cells.
With each use?
Well, it's context dependent. So at certain doses, at certain frequencies, right? If you give ketamine to like a teenage monkey daily for like 3 months, there'll be some serious kind of damage to the brain of that monkey, right? So there's a couple things that play into this. One is the dose, one is the frequency, and one is the cumulative exposure, and those things. So as ketamine, the way this works, it's very there's a loophole in the way that medicine is regulated that's very relevant to this topic, because esketamine has FDA approval and it also has strict controls on it, right? Like you can't do take-home dosing. You can't, you really should, can't do dosing above a certain threshold, above a certain frequency. So if you stay close to what are the analogs for that in ketamine, I think you're in reasonably good shape. But there are a lot of people who just they just disregard it, or they have no idea what it's for. And so they just, they'll do like daily ketamine or really high doses that I think is really not a good idea.
Right.
Because of, ketamine's neurotoxic.
Yeah. And I think this kind of, maybe it's part of the discussion of like Matthew Perry, for example, from Friends.
Yes.
Did that relate to, because he died from ketamine, right?
He did.
And so is that similar to like what you're talking about like the neurotoxin?
Well, I don't think he died because of the neurotoxicity, but he died because he was receiving ketamine in a therapeutic sense, and he liked it, and he asked his doctors to do it more, and they said no, and he said okay, and he left, and he got it from a kind of a shady source, right? I think somewhere there was a medical license involved, and so he was taking it at home in more of a kind of a self-monitored or really unmonitored setting. And he took enough of it that he basically took an anesthetic level of it, and then he passed out and he fell in his pool and he drowned. So if he would have taken that much in a monitored setting, he would have fallen asleep for like, maybe 30 minutes and then woken up and then been fine. But because he was like sitting on the edge of a pool, he fell in and he drowned. But that's another important control, because for esketamine, the FDA, as part of their restrictions on it, when they said, we're going to approve this, but it has to be done in a clinic, so you can't do esketamine at home, the nasal spray. But because ketamine is not FDA approved for depression, the FDA doesn't really have controls around it. And some people think, that means ketamine's safer than esketamine. When that's not the case, it's just a loophole in the way that medicine is regulated. And so there are clinics that will send you ketamine at home and say, here, take this at home and blah, blah, blah. And I think that's really not a good idea.
Right. Should only, probably be taken like in a controlled environment.
Yes. /
like you said, like you're saying, only once, maybe like, what would you say, like a month, maybe?
Well, in the initial, the way that esketamine works, the initial dosing protocol is twice a week for about a month, and then once a week for a month. So getting it weekly is okay at a certain dose. You don't want to do it daily, and there's a variety of reasons that we could go into. But daily dosing, I don't think really makes sense in any setting. Doing it weekly or less frequently, you're as long as it's below a certain dose threshold, that's generally safe. If you're close to the esketamine protocols.
And what about like, for example, like using this in, because obviously, like if they administer this weekly or like, let's say like bi-weekly, what is the effect it has on like depression? Because obviously you said it's used for depression. Yeah. What's the science behind that with ketamine?
Yeah, well, the real answer is we don't know. And the reason we don't know is because there's this huge gap between the mind and the brain, right? Mm-hmm. Despite a lot of advances in neuroscience and psychology and so forth, there's still a very large chasm between, how, okay, you have physical things like neurons and transmitters and so forth. And then you have non-physical things like thoughts and emotions and feelings. And we don't, no one can really make any progress in how one produces or interacts with the other. But if you want an answer, what it is thought is that ketamine will increase the brain's ability to be adaptive, or what is called plasticity. So
like neuroplasticity.
Yes. So depression, as well as other mental illnesses, increasingly seem to be disorders of plasticity, or the brain's ability to adapt. And you can see evidence of this from some neuroimaging studies and other types of investigations. And at least when we look at this in like animal models of mental illness, like rodents, there seems to be a pretty robust enhancement in neuroplasticity and really nerves having new connections with each other just like 24 hours after a single exposure of ketamine. Mm-hmm. So we think that has something to do with it. And that's probably the leading hypothesis.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, it would make sense in my mind, like creating that increased neuroplasticity in order to treat the depression ultimately. What about with PTSD? Is that also used for that as well?
Well, it's been investigated. Most of the research is frankly with esketamine in depression, the nasal spray. The next most is with IV ketamine, intravenous ketamine in depression. There's a little bit of research with things like IV ketamine in PTSD, but it's less developed. So right. It does seem to be helpful, but it's not approved for that use.
Oh, okay. Interesting. Yeah, because I was recently reading this book. It's called like The Tell, and essentially this book was talking about how this woman was using MDMA actually.
Okay.
And she had some memories like come up from her childhood of like this person who had like sexually abused her, and I guess it was kind of the questioning was like, okay, did this? I guess like some people were questioning like, did this really happen? Because like they're thinking the MDMA, the psychedelic was what brought that to the surface. Is that like possible for it to bring up like suppressed memories? Do we know?
I think that's a fairly controversial area. I mean, the field of psychiatry went through this whole thing of, somewhat independent of psychedelics. I think it was called the psychiatric memory wars, where there was this phenomenon that clinicians said they uncovered that, patients had these repressed memories and they drudged them up but that was fairly controversial. And there was frankly, some harm that was done in that period. So can that happen? Yeah. It's possible to have repressed memories, but it's not like a main thing in psychiatry anymore. Unfortunately, psychiatry goes through a lot of fads. That was a fad much more so like in the 90s, 1990s than it is now. Maybe it'll be resurfacing with the new fad of psychedelics that we're kind of in the midst of, and how that might have bearing for, patients' well-being.
How common is like a bad trip? Like for somebody to have a bad trip on ketamine?
Okay, so for ketamine, we don't have great estimates, but from my clinical experience, doing it in the clinic in a very controlled setting, with the doses that we use, I would say like, 1 in 100 to 1 in 200 treatments. Okay. Now,
have a bad trip.
What's that?
Have a bad trip. 1 in 200. Okay.
Yeah. The clinical term that we use for it at Yale is a dysphoric reaction. But it's probably similar to what you sometimes hear on the street. The phrase is a K-hole. K for ketamine.
Right.
Now these can be really scary, but they're relatively easy to manage in a controlled setting. I mean, a handful, once or twice I can think of that it really required some skill and serious intervention. But the problem is if you do them at home, then it can be catastrophic.
Right.
And unfortunately, there are a number of, because of the practice of at-home ketamine, there are, there are cases that are surfacing. So there was a Wall Street Journal article published, I think just this week, that mentioned a case in Montana of a woman with 4 kids whose husband was away for work. And, she was given at-home ketamine by prescription. And she took it and must have been not quite in her right mind. And, she killed her 4 children and then tried to kill herself and, called 911 sometime in that episode. Wow, yeah. And they came and, it's just terribly tragic, obviously, right. So if that were done in a controlled setting, that wouldn't have happened. There would have been medical personnel to make sure that this patient was not doing things
right.
to lead to those things. So those are going to be somewhat rare, but they are happening, and the reports are starting to come out that when ketamine is used and in the at-home setting, that bad stuff happens. So so I'm pretty I've written about this in the literature. I've spoken about this, that hey, you need to be sticking close to the restrictions the FDA put on esketamine, even if you're using the off-label ketamine.
Right.
Because of things like this.
Yeah. Would you recommend ketamine for anybody struggling with treatment-resistant depression?
Well, that's what esketamine is approved for by the FDA. So I wouldn't say for anyone. I mean, one of the things that we think really carefully about is if someone is also struggling with substances.
Right.
Because, that's kind of precisely what happened with Matthew Perry.
Yeah.
As he was introduced to it. Matthew Perry was very vocal about having a strong history of substance problems himself. And, I think maybe he was clean at the time he started this therapeutically, but then kind of really grew to like this and sought it on the street. And ended up with problems. So,
right.
So, if a patient has treatment-resistant depression and serious substance problems, then I'm going to be very, very hesitant to say, let's do ketamine.
Yeah. Well, thank you for describing the ketamine piece. I really want to dive into your book, Purpose.
Okay, sounds good.
So
a bit of a 180, but
right, bit of a 180, but I really don't want to miss out on this opportunity because very interested in your book, Purpose. I had the chance to read it.
Okay.
Super interesting. You got a lot of praise for it, and I think well deserved as well. Can you just give us a little synopsis of the book for those who have not read it?
Yeah. So the title, as you mentioned, is very brief. Purpose, with the subtitle a little bit more descriptive. Purpose: what evolution and human nature imply about the meaning of our existence. And probably one way to think about this book is kind of a science faith book or a science kind of philosophy book, depending on where you're coming from. But I wrote this book, based really on experiences I had as a medical student. When I first started medical school, for whatever reason, what I was learning in the classroom kind of made me question whether there's any purpose to life and whether what I had learned, growing up in Sunday school had any truth to it. And so, I went through.
What do you feel like made you, if you don't mind me asking, what do you feel like made you question, where did it come to the butting heads of science and religion for you?
Well, it was the theory of evolution, right? And I'd been exposed to it earlier in my education. So I don't quite understand why at this time it became a really kind of pressing issue for me, but it did. And so, I went through a period of several months where I was, reading, I was studying, I was really thinking and meditating, praying about how does this work? Which worldview is right?
Right.
And I had this experience where things just seemed to come together in a way that for me was really fulfilling from both an intellectual and a sort of spiritual or philosophical perspective. And, that was in 2009. And I said, well, at some point I'd like to write a book about this. And I had to put it on hold for about a decade, and then I was able to kind of fulfill that goal that I had.
So do you feel like following that experience, was it almost a realization that science and religion can coexist?
Yes, for me, yes.
Okay, very interesting. And and there's so much I want to ask about this book, but the next thing I'm kind of wondering is, from what I understood from the book, is it's very much kind of a, I don't want to say an argument against Darwinism, but an idea of like how it can exist with like God can exist within the confines of evolutionary theory.
Correct.
Am I saying that correct?
Yeah, I would say, I think part of it was what I thought I knew about evolution. That was what was in conflict. And when I really delved into it, the pieces seemed to fit in a way that it was like, one of those aha moments.
Yeah. Can you explain to us real quick? I know you talk a little bit about how, I'm gonna like forget the name here, but the idea that it works within that confined, like evolution works within like this like confine of like
constraints.
Yes.
Yeah. So one of the aspects of evolution that I think has been off-putting to either people of faith or people that think like life has purpose is the notion of randomness, right? So when we think of evolution, most of us think, oh, this is totally random and haphazard process. And there have been some, thinkers in biology who have said this is how it is. Like if we rewound the tape of time and let the process unfold again, there would certainly be no humans. There would be, weird looking blob creatures, who knows, whatever.
Right.
But it turns out that, especially in the last, say, 30 years, there's been a lot of evidence suggesting that that's not the case, and that it's much more kind of constrained and I'll even use the term guided than people think. So the biological term for this is evolutionary convergence, where you have kind of two separate lines of species, and they each develop the same thing. Okay. And this happens over and over and over and over again. So, as just one example, birds and bats and butterflies, they all have wings, right? But they didn't like all inherit their wings from the same common ancestor. They all developed them independently, and they're all, constructed slightly differently. But they all developed them. If you look at a dolphin and a shark, they look very, very similar, right? You would think that they're closely related, but they're not. Okay. So what we're told is that the dolphin's ancestors were land dwelling, and they somehow kind of, migrated back to the water.
Oh, wow.
And they developed a fusiform body that helps them swim with fins and flippers and so forth. And even the shading, right? A dolphin and a shark, many species are kind of darkly colored on top and lightly colored on the bottom. And the reason for that is kind of camouflage, because if you're looking at it from above, it's dark and it blends in with the darkness. Looking at it from below, it's kind of light and blends in with the light, right? So that kind of body feature that developed independently in the shark and the dolphin. And this goes on and on and on. Pretty much everything in biology has developed more than once, right? One of the really interesting examples is eyes. Okay. So we have virtually the identical structure of eyes as like an octopus. Okay. But we did not like inherit them from the same lineage, right? We each developed them independently. So you think of an eye, which is an incredibly complex structure of biological matter, so there's something that is guiding this to be developed independently, right? So this is the story of evolutionary convergence. So Richard Dawkins, by the way, I don't know if you know who, but he is one of the most outspoken atheists. He's an evolutionary biologist. He asked a colleague of his, can you think of any, quote, good ideas in biology that developed only once? Okay. So things like eyes, wings, whatever. And his friend could think of like a handful, right? So most things have developed more than once, right? Whether it's like the circulatory system in both mammals and birds, they have basically the identical circulatory system. They develop independently. A form of photosynthesis develops 60 different times, right? Like, how does that happen, right? So what I'm not saying is that evolution didn't happen, but I'm saying that it was not random, or at least there were many aspects to it that weren't. but that it was constrained, it was guided, it was kind of bound to go in certain directions rather than others.
More purposeful, right?
Well, potentially, right? Now the argument of convergence doesn't like automatically say, okay, yeah, there's a God, there's a purpose, but it brings those worldviews a little closer together. Right?
I see.
It's a lot more satisfying for me academically and kind of religiously, philosophically to kind of see, okay, God didn't just leave this totally up to chance. There was some kind of mechanism, there was some pattern here. And, I don't know exactly how, the details and how there was intervention or whatnot, but clearly this was not random.
Right.
Okay.
And, I'm really curious while we're kind of in this vein of like controversial topics between maybe like people of religion and people of, maybe atheists, for example, is this idea that you talk about in your book of like free will.
Sure.
Which is obviously, a very dicey topic and has been since basically the beginning of time in philosophy.
Well, I think only among nerds has it been a controversial topic, right? The vast majority of humanity goes around assuming and recognizing, hey, I've got free will. And also, hopefully I'm responsible for my actions and so forth.
Right.
But yeah, so it's been controversial among a small group of nerds, basically.
Yes. Yeah. And you have, people on both sides of the spectrum, right? Like maybe like Robert Sapolsky, from Stanford, who was like very like deterministic, right? Like
sure.
He's like everything's determined and there's no way to like go around that. What are your kind of thoughts as far as that? Like, what would you be your case for like the free will?
Well, I think there are two aspects to this, two fundamental aspects. And one is with determinism. Okay, so do we live in a deterministic universe or not? And a deterministic universe is one where if you know the past or the present with absolute certainty, you can predict with 100% the future. You can know where all the molecules are going and so forth. And obviously, no human brain can comprehend that. But, we're getting into the age of AI where something like that may in fact be possible, right?
Yeah.
Still, I think it's quite a ways. So, for my version of free will, I think there needs, and by the way, I don't want to ever come off as saying, I prove that free will is real. If you talk to the purist philosophers, they'll say, well, you can't actually prove whether the universe is deterministic or indeterministic. So it's, but from all the evidence, it seems like the universe is, and especially biological creatures, not just humans, but even relatively simple ones like nematode worms and so forth. They seem to act and behave in ways that are indeterministic, meaning that you can't fully predict. You can guess and there's probabilities, right? I do think behavior is probabilistic, but I don't think it's deterministic. So you can say, hey, if I do this, people are more likely to, if I spend $5 million on a Super Bowl ad, people are more likely to buy my product, right? That's clearly happens.
Right.
But you're not going to be able to, I don't think ever say, I'm going to, pay $5 million for a Super Bowl ad and I can predict the individuals who will buy my product. Right. Yes. I just don't think and I think the evidence from biology and physics, leans toward a indeterministic universe. Okay. So that's one. I think that's now some people have kind of more, constrained definitions of free will and say, well, you can even have free will if the universe is deterministic. But I would disagree. I think that's a watered down version of free will.
Yeah.
The other kind of necessary thing, right? Because even if you prove the universe is indeterministic, like that doesn't prove free will. Then you need to kind of link like intentions and thoughts with actions, right? Because you could say, yeah, the universe is indeterministic. This kid just had a seizure. They moved about in a very unpredictable way, but that's not free will, right? That behavior is not, for free will, I think there needs to be a connection between intentions and thoughts and behaviors. And I think the psychological literature is pretty rich with examples that fulfill that. And where this comes from is, experiments showing where participants are prompted to think in a certain way versus another way that influences their actions. Okay.
Yes. Yeah. Very interesting. Yeah, I feel like that's fascinating like topic of like just being able to feel a sense of free will. And I feel like we all want to feel that, right? I think we ultimately want to feel that we have control over our lives. I feel like that gives
sometimes we're less likely to take responsibility, but we can work on that.
Absolutely, right? Because again, kind of that extreme version of like not even having prisons, or for example, it's like this. It kind of seems like almost a radical idea of if everything's determined, then maybe we should have more empathy, which I do think the empathy piece is good, but it's also got to be linked to the action, right?
Sure, yeah, and like Robert Sapolsky, he's probably one of the more well-known people who's like, he wrote a popular book about why he thinks free will is not a real thing. I don't think he's trying to say we should just live in a lawless society. He just thinks that we shouldn't blame criminals and things. And to a certain degree, I think he's right. I think our context, our environments have a huge amount of influence on our behavior, as do our genetics, right?
Yeah.
There's biology, there's environment. But I do think there's a space there for personal choice.
And that's where we assume, I guess, kind of work, right? Is that space of choice. And I guess, are you saying that because there is that space and exists, therefore we can say generally that free will kind of exists?
That's my argument.
Okay. Yeah. Very interesting. Thank you for sharing. I kind of want to dive with the last few minutes that we have here into one more piece of your book, if that's okay.
Sure.
Is this, you have a chapter on like lust versus love.
Yeah.
Can you describe that to us?
Well, sure. That the whole general purpose, or the general kind of principle here is what, one of the things that I didn't like about what I thought evolutionary theory said was what it implied about human nature. Mm-hmm. And a lot of people who, don't necessarily have degrees in biology or something, when they think of evolution and its connection to like behavior, especially human behavior, they're going to think, we're ultimately selfish and aggressive and so forth, right? And I think there is truth to that. It's not hard to think of examples where humans have behaved in terribly selfish and even violent ways, right? So I do think there's an aspect of that, but there are other kind of ways that evolution has worked that has created opposing tendencies and capacities, right? You could also make the case that humans are incredibly cooperative, that we have a capacity for altruism, right? And so on and so forth. So, one of the core principles of my book, Purpose, is that the way that evolution has shaped us leaves us pulled in different directions. We have capacities for selfishness, but also altruism. And it pulls on us in a very real way. And when you combine that with the principle, the experience of free will, to me, this strongly implies that one of the purposes of our existence is to choose between these competing natures, right? Mm. What, biologists would call selfish and altruism, the theologian would call good and evil. So I think that's kind of hardwired into the way that we were created and into the nature that we seem to have.
Is it almost this conflict that we have between like, I can get certain things if I'm, if I go this route of like this more, I guess, like evil route, quote unquote, maybe this more like lustful or this more like selfish route.
Yes.
But I can also get a lot from this altruistic route. Is it kind of that conflict between like, you can get something from both?
Well, yeah. So the question, so this comes down to what you might call the levels of selection. Okay. So, one of the phrases that has become associated with evolution over time is this phrase, survival of the fittest, right? Mm, and when people think of survival of the fittest, they tend to think of the negative aspects of human nature, right? Selfishness, aggression. But I think to really answer the question, or really to kind of hone in on this, you need to flip that phrase into a question. And you ask, survival of the fittest what? Are we talking about a survival of the fittest individual or a survival of the fittest family or group? And when you think about the traits that would have been helpful, it depends on that level. You're talking about the individual level or the family level, right? Because if you have, so let me I'll share a brief story that I think hammers this home pretty well. In the 1860s, there were two ships that wrecked on opposite ends of this group of islands in the South Pacific. Okay. And the first ship was led by a man named Musgrave. Okay. Now, fortunately, all of the crew from his ship survived. Okay. After they were stranded for 18 months, a long time.
Oh, wow.
Okay.
Oh,
yeah.
Lord.
Yeah. This was pretty intense. It was miraculous. The other ship was led by a man named Dalgarno. Now, most of the crew from his ship died. Okay. Now, the islands were big enough that the men didn't know of one another. They didn't, the parties did not find each other and work. They were isolated, right? But they were on, at the same time, roughly, they were on different ends of this, fairly large archipelago. Okay. Now, so what was the key difference, right? Why did one group have a 100% survival rate, and why did the other group have less than 50% survival rate? So the key difference was that the group that survived, they worked together. Okay. They cooperated. And you saw this in the very first minutes, really, of the shipwreck. The captain, Musgrave himself, he carried an injured man on his back as he swam from the wreckage to the shore. Okay. That's hard to do. I mean, I have my 3-year-old on my back in the pool, and it's that's hard to swim like that, right? So, that kind of set the whole tone and tenor of the ordeal, was working together, right? And the flip side, the shipwreck, they had the opposite. They took kind of an every man for himself approach. And this was seen in the first day or so of their shipwreck. When they left an injured man on the beach who died, they left him behind to search for food and other resources as they went inland.
Oh, wow.
So, you can see how, right, in maybe opposite to what you might think, it wasn't selfishness that helped survival. It was working together as a group. It was altruism and cooperation. That's one of the key things that led the first group to kind of all survive in a really remarkable way. And so, in some contexts, survival is a group endeavor, right? So when you can easily think about similar scenarios in the ancient past of our ancestors, where it wasn't selfishness, but it was altruism, cooperation that helped for survival, right? But you could also maybe think of times when selfishness was helpful for survival, right? So the question is, which was it that predominated in the past, the past that none of us have exact access to? I think it was both. There were certain contexts in which, selfishness was helpful for survival, and that became a little bit of a part of our nature. But there were also contexts where it was a survival of the fittest group or family. And so there needed to be some altruism and cooperation. So I think, through a long, varied course of evolution, I think both capacities were built into us. Okay.
Yeah.
By these different levels. And I think that's why family is so important, because the strongest forms of love and affection and altruism and so forth, all these good things, they have their root in the way that nature shaped the development of family relationships, right? We share genes with our family. That's a very biological thing, right? Evolution, from a certain perspective, is very family kind of focused, right? You're going to look after your kid because he carries your genes. That's how I think the strongest forms of love were created in the flesh.
Oh, wow.
Does that make sense?
Very interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of and almost going from a psychology perspective, it's I guess think about what you're talking about here of having either being selfish or not selfish also comes down to the question, can we, I guess, stomach that? Do we have the morals to not be selfish, or...
And do we have the wherewithal to put ourselves in contexts that bring out our better natures? And this, again, is where I think family is really important, because, the literature from sociology about this is huge. That when people, especially men, are embedded within family context and linked to their children, by the way, the most efficient way to do that is through marriage. But when men are embedded in family context, they're less likely to engage in criminal behavior. They're less likely to engage in substance use and so forth. There's all these things, right? We talk about behavior being probabilistic. There's still a choice, but it's they're nudged much more in the better angels of their nature.
Kind of the training ground of altruism, I guess.
Yes, exactly. I think to me, this is how God created the family to be so important.
Yeah.
Is through evolutionary mechanisms. Now, a lot of people would think, oh, that I don't think about those in the same thought. But to me, the pieces fit together.
Wow.
Yeah.
Very interesting. Thank you so much for your time. I know we got to wrap up, but where can people find your book, Purpose?
It's sold on Amazon, most places that you can order books. I think Walmart, Target, Amazon is the place where most people get their books these days. So I think that's a fine place to get it.
Awesome. Wonderful. Well, thank you so much again. And his book, Purpose, Dr. Samuel Wilkinson. Thanks
for having me.
Appreciate it.